In 1988, Frank Sinatra stormed into Dean Martin's darkened mansion, desperate to save his best friend from drowning in grief. Dean, shattered by the loss of his son, was ready to disappear into the shadows. But what Frank didn't understand was that some wounds don't heal in the spotlight. And then, Dean did something no one expected. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. That I end the spring of 1988. The world watched as Frank Sinatra tried to pull his best friend, Dean Martin, back into the light. The spotlight was always their shared refuge, the stage where they conquered the world together. But now, Dean was no longer the vibrant star he once was. The grief of losing his son, Dino Jr., had consumed him. It wasn't just the death of his son that had broken him. It was the loss of his purpose. Dean, at 69, sat in the darkened mansion in Beverly Hills, surrounded by silence, a silence he had chosen as his refuge. He had been through heartache before, divorce, disappointment, the death of friends, but nothing had prepared him for this. Frank, at 72, couldn't stand it. Frank was a man who believed in action, in moving forward no matter the cost. And when Dean shut himself off, Frank couldn't accept it. The night was dark, but Frank wasn't used to darkness. The next day, he stormed into Dean's mansion, the same way he always entered a room, with confidence, with power, with the belief that his energy could change everything. But this time, Frank wasn't walking into a room full of admiration. He was walking into a man's silence that even he couldn't crack. Frank walked in like a force of nature, his presence impossible to ignore. He was dressed impeccably, his tailored suit sharp, his cologne strong. The difference between them could not have been clearer. Frank was still the chairman of the board, the man who knew no defeat, the man who could bend the world to his will. Dean, on the other hand, was a shadow of his former self. He had withdrawn into himself, rejecting the world he had once dominated. As Frank flipped on the lights, Dean's reaction was subtle. He winced. The light seemed to burn him, as if Frank's arrival only illuminated how far gone Dean had truly become. Dean didn't move, his body still as stone. His response to Frank was nothing more than a quiet, "I'm fine." But Frank wasn't buying it. "No, you're not," Frank snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "You're rotting in here, Dean. You're letting the darkness swallow you whole." Dean didn't argue. There was no fight left in him. He wasn't trying to be strong anymore. He wasn't trying to be anything. Frank, though, refused to see it. He refused to accept that his best friend had given up. So, in classic Frank style, he offered a solution. "We're going on tour. You, me, Sammy. One last ride. We'll get you back. We'll knock them dead." But Dean's response was a quiet refusal, a simple, "I don't want the old days, Frank. I want my son back." Frank stood there, stunned. He had tried to solve every problem in his life with sheer willpower, with action, with work. But here was Dean, broken not by time, not by age, but by something deeper, something that no amount of work could fix. Frank didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to process that Dean was choosing grief over life. To Frank, life was about pushing forward, about surviving, about refusing to let anything beat you. But Dean had already given up on the fight. He wasn't interested in the applause, the music, the stage anymore. "This isn't about you, Frank," Dean finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is about my son, and no amount of applause is going to bring him back." Frank felt a pang of frustration, but also something else, something he wasn't ready to admit. He wasn't just angry at Dean for shutting him out. He was angry because he couldn't fix this. He wasn't used to not being able to fix things. Frank had spent a lifetime bending the world to his will. This was something else entirely. Frank clenched his fists. "Don't you think you owe it to yourself to try? To live again?" Dean looked at him, his eyes hollow. "I'm not interested in living, Frank. Not without my son." Despite the emotional disconnect, Frank wasn't ready to give up. "We'll go on stage together, D. You, me, Sammy, the old gang. You'll remember what it felt like. You'll find the light again. Just one more time." Dean looked at Frank, his face unreadable. Dean's hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of his body, failing him. His kidneys were deteriorating, his health was slipping, and nothing in the world could make him feel whole again. "I'm not going, Frank." Dean said, his voice cracking slightly. "I can't pretend anymore." But Frank wasn't listening. His mind was fixed on the idea that if he just pushed hard enough, if he just kept pushing Dean, he could drag him out of the darkness. They flew to Oakland for the first show of the tour. 15,000 people packed the Coliseum, their cheers deafening. Frank was at the front, commanding the crowd, hyping them up, as if every show would bring Dean back to life. Sammy Davis Jr. was the bridge, the one who could keep the energy high between them. But it wasn't enough. Dean stood on stage, shaking, singing when he was supposed to, smiling when he was supposed to, but his eyes were vacant. He wasn't there. Not really. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold and far away, where grief was the only thing left. The tour continued, but Dean's presence was more of a performance than a revival. In Denver, Frank was once again in his element, laughing, talking, commanding attention. He was surrounded by industry people, hangers-on, beautiful women, all clinging to his every word. But Dean, he sat quietly in a corner, tossing bread rolls at the wall, over and over. He wasn't participating, wasn't engaging. He wasn't even really there. Frank saw it. He had to have seen it. Dean wasn't playing the part he was meant to play. He wasn't laughing, wasn't even pretending to enjoy himself. And yet, Frank refused to acknowledge it. He thought it was just another bump in the road. He thought that, if he just kept pushing Dean, if he kept making the world spin, his best friend would eventually return to him. "Come on, D. Just give it a smile," Frank would say, desperately. But Dean's smiles weren't for Frank anymore. They were just masks. At night, when the party was in full swing, Frank found himself trying to talk to Dean, to force him back into the world, but all Dean wanted was silence. He didn't want noise, didn't want the fake joy that surrounded him. He wanted to be left alone. But Frank wasn't ready to let go yet. He thought he could save Dean. He was wrong. The tension between Frank and Dean was thick. Frank had no idea what Dean was truly going through. His grief wasn't just sadness. It was a physical weight, something that crushed him every day. It wasn't about finding a way to move on. It was about living with the constant ache of losing his son. Dean had been a performer his whole life, a man who lived to entertain, to be loved by crowds, to be the cool, easygoing one who never seemed to be bothered by anything. But this was different. The spotlight that had once been a refuge now felt like a noose around his neck. Every cheer from the crowd felt like a reminder that he was pretending to be something he wasn't anymore. And every city they went to, every hotel room they stayed in, just added another layer of isolation. Frank could see the change, but he didn't understand it. The audience didn't see it either. To them, Dean was still the man who made them laugh, the man who could make everything feel light. But to Dean, it was all just noise. Frank could see that, but he couldn't accept it. He was too focused on the idea that if he just kept the show going, if he just kept forcing Dean into the spotlight, everything would go back to normal. But nothing was normal anymore. The day in Chicago, at the Rosemont Horizon, was different. Frank could feel it in the air as soon as they arrived. The cold hit him first, biting through his coat and settling deep into his bones. But it wasn't just the weather that felt off. There was something darker in the air, something that had been building up over the past few weeks. Dean's eyes were different. His usually sharp gaze was clouded, his face expressionless. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't passive either. There was something brewing inside him, something that couldn't be ignored. Frank tried to motivate him, tried to joke around, tried to get Dean to crack a smile. But Dean wasn't playing along. Frank had spent his whole career controlling the room, controlling the energy. But now, it felt like Dean had taken that control away from him. And Frank was scared. Scared that he was losing his best friend. Scared that the man he had tried so hard to save didn't want saving. The crowd roared as the show began. Frank led the charge, singing, telling jokes, trying to inject energy into every moment. But Dean was distant. He stood on the stage, singing when he was supposed to, but his voice was flat, his movements robotic. He wasn't part of the show anymore. He was just going through the motions. Frank looked at him and realized something he hadn't been ready to see. Dean wasn't coming back to IT was halfway through the show when everything came to a head. Dean, in the middle of a song, took a drag from his cigarette. The smoke filled the air, curling around him like a cloud of resignation. He had been told not to smoke on stage anymore, but he didn't care. He didn't care about the rules. He didn't care about the performance. He didn't care about anything anymore. As the smoke swirled around him, he stared out at the audience, 15,000 faces staring back at him, waiting for him to do something, anything. But he wasn't seeing them. He wasn't seeing anything. He was lost in his own mind, trapped in the dark place he had been living in for months. The silence in his heart had grown too loud to ignore. And that's when it happened. He flicked the cigarette away, and for a moment, the room went quiet. Frank was next to him, trying to keep the energy up, but Dean wasn't listening anymore. "Come on, D, give them that smile," Frank urged, trying to get Dean to play his part. But Dean's response was quiet, almost too soft to hear over the crowd's roar. "I'm going home, Frank." The words were simple, but they shattered everything. The audience didn't hear it. The band didn't stop. But Frank did. For the first time, he stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. The shock in Frank's eyes was undeniable. He stood there on stage, the light still shining down on him, but his world had suddenly collapsed. Dean wasn't just quitting the show. He was quitting everything. Frank had always believed in action, in moving forward, in never stopping. But Dean wasn't moving. He wasn't running away from something. He was walking toward something. The grave of his son, the place where his heart had stopped beating months ago. As Dean walked off that stage, not backstage, not to the wings, but straight through the crowd and out the door, Frank's mind raced. How could Dean do this to him? To the fans? To the legacy they had built together? Frank was left in a storm of emotions, trying to reconcile the man he loved with the man who was walking away from it all. He followed Dean's departure with his eyes, but no one could follow what Dean had just done. Frank, for once, couldn't bend the world to his will. As Dean got into the limo, leaving the tour, leaving everything behind, Frank remained frozen in the lights, unable to process the betrayal. He had tried to save his friend, tried to pull him from the abyss, but Dean had chosen the abyss, and Frank had no idea how to deal with it. Dean walked through the cold, past the fans, past the limos, past the people who had spent the night chanting his name. He wasn't a performer anymore. He wasn't the king of cool. He wasn't the man who could smile his way through anything. He was just a father who had lost his son, a man who had been pretending to be something he wasn't for too long. He climbed into the back of the limo, the driver asking where to take him. "Home," Dean replied, his voice steady, but his eyes vacant. He didn't want to go back to the stage, didn't want to go back to the life Frank had been trying to pull him into. He just wanted to sit in the silence again, in the place where his son's memory could be the only thing he had left. Back at the venue, Frank stood, staring at the stage, his mind still reeling. He couldn't understand why Dean had walked off, why he hadn't stayed for the fans, for the show, for their history. Frank had done everything for Dean, but Dean hadn't wanted saving. He had wanted peace. Frank couldn't give him that. As the show continued without him, it felt like everything had shifted. The world, it seemed, was turning without Dean Martin. Frank had been the one to make the world spin, but not this time. This time, Dean had stopped it. The next few days were a blur of confusion, anger, and betrayal. The press had a field day, labeling Dean as unprofessional, a coward, a washed-up has-been. Frank didn't care about the press. What hurt was the silence between him and Dean. They didn't speak. Not once. Dean was back in his mansion, shut off from the world, the curtains still drawn, the television still flickering silently in the background. He had withdrawn completely, and Frank, despite all his power, couldn't reach him. There were rumors about what had happened in Chicago, about Dean's sudden departure, but Frank didn't correct them. He didn't care what anyone thought. He couldn't even care enough to feel angry anymore. It was as if the entire thing had broken something inside of him. The tour continued, but it was hollow. Frank smiled, sang, performed, but it wasn't the same. The magic was gone. The chemistry that had once defined the Rat Pack was now fractured, irreparable. Frank had tried to pull Dean back into the world. He had tried to save him, but it hadn't worked. Dean had chosen to leave, and now Frank was left alone. The fame, the fortune, the crowds, they didn't matter. What mattered was the one man he couldn't fix, that in the months that followed. Frank's world started to feel emptier. He performed, as he always had, But there was a weight to every note, every laugh, every joke. The audience didn't know what had happened. They didn't understand the pain that had become part of Frank's life. He was the chairman of the board, the king of swing, but none of that could fill the hole left by Dean's absence. Frank went through the motions, surrounded by people, yet more alone than he had ever been. The loss wasn't just about Dean walking off the stage. It was about the fact that Frank had failed. He had failed to save his best friend. He had failed to understand that sometimes love wasn't enough. Sometimes the darkness was stronger than the light, and that was something Frank couldn't accept. In the quiet of his hotel rooms, after the lights went down and the applause faded, Frank would sit alone, contemplating what had happened. The questions never stopped. Could he have done more? Could he have pushed harder? Could he have been the man Dean needed? But deep down, Frank knew the truth. No amount of pushing, no amount of work, could bring Dean back from the place he had gone. And Frank was too proud to admit that sometimes you have to let someone go. It was 3 years later, on Christmas morning, that the final chapter of Dean Martin's story was written. He died alone in his sleep, quietly, in the same mansion where Frank had once tried to save him. The press reported it in their usual sensational way, calling it a sad end to a storied career, a legend who had lost his way. But for those who truly knew him, the truth was far more complex. Dean didn't die because he had given up. He died because he had finally made peace with his loss. Frank, meanwhile, stayed away from the funeral. Some say it was because he was too ill to attend. Others say it was because he was still angry, still unable to forgive Dean for walking away. But there was another reason, one that no one talked about. Frank was broken. He had spent years trying to save a man who didn't want saving. And now, the man he had loved like a brother was gone. There was no reconciliation, no last conversation to make sense of it all. Just the silence, just the finality of death, leaving Frank to face the fact that some things, some people, were beyond even his reach. The years that followed Dean's death saw Frank continue to perform, but it was never the same. There was a crack in his confidence, a shadow that followed him no matter how bright the lights were. His shows still drew crowds. His voice still commanded attention, but the magic was gone. Frank Sinatra, the man who had bent the world to his will, now felt like a man who had been bent by the world. And the reason for that was simple. He had failed Dean. Frank had always believed that love could overcome anything. He believed that he could drag anyone back from the darkness if he just loved them enough, if he just pushed hard enough. But Dean had proven him wrong. Dean had needed something that Frank could never give him, the space to grieve, the permission to be broken. In Frank's eyes, that was a weakness, a failure to keep fighting. But for Dean, it was the only way to find peace. And in that, Frank had learned one of the hardest lessons of his life. Sometimes, love means letting go. Sometimes, the greatest act of friendship is allowing someone to walk away, even if it means losing them forever. Dean's death marked the final closing of a chapter that neither Frank nor the world could fully understand. Frank's grief was different from what the public saw. It wasn't the anger or the sadness that the press had painted it to be. It was the realization that his best friend, the man he had shared everything with, had chosen something he couldn't reach. Dean's solitude had been his way of coping, his way of dealing with the unthinkable. Frank, on the other hand, had always thrived in the spotlight, in the company of others. He was the man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and never let it show. But with Dean gone, that weight seemed heavier than ever. Frank spent his days with a forced smile, his nights in silence. The tour continued, but it wasn't the same. Sammy Davis Jr. was no longer the bridge between them. Frank's desperation to get back to the old days, to return to the times when things were simpler, only made things worse. The public still adored him, but in his heart, Frank was alone. His best friend was gone, and there was nothing he could do to change that. It wasn't until after Dean's death that Frank finally understood the true depth of their friendship. The press had called him a failure. The industry had moved on. But for Frank, there was no moving on. There was only the haunting question of what more he could have done. And then, in the quiet moments, the memories came flooding back, of the times they laughed together, the nights they drank and talked about life, about the future. Frank remembered the early days, when they were young and full of hope, when they had dreamed of nothing but success. But those dreams had crumbled, just like their friendship. Frank had tried to keep it alive, tried to fix everything with his strength, his influence, but he hadn't understood the one thing that Dean had needed: space to heal, to be broken, to grieve. Dean had needed to let go of the past, and Frank had needed to let go of him. The realization came slowly, but it hit him like a wave. Frank couldn't fix everything. And sometimes, love wasn't about saving someone. It was about knowing when to let them go. The years after Dean's death were filled with an emptiness that Frank couldn't escape. He threw himself into work, albums, concerts, public appearances, but it never felt the same. There was always something missing. In the quiet of his hotel rooms, when the applause had died down and the crowd was gone, Frank would often find himself staring out the window, thinking of Dean. The loss was a wound that never healed. Frank had always been the one who fixed everything, the one who found a way to keep going no matter what. But this was different. This was something Frank couldn't control, something he couldn't change. He had tried so hard to bring Dean back to life, to force him out of his grief, to pull him into the light, and in the end, it had cost them both. Frank never forgave himself for what happened. He never forgave himself for not seeing the depth of Dean's pain, for not understanding that some things are too deep to fix. Dean had left him with a lesson that Frank could never fully accept. Sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you can't save someone. Sometimes, the only thing you can do is let them go. Even if it breaks your heart, Frank's reaction to Dean's death wasn't one of immediate sadness. It was anger, a deep, simmering rage that he couldn't direct anywhere. He was angry at Dean for walking away, for choosing to be broken instead of fighting for the life they had built together. He was angry at himself for not doing more, for not being able to fix the unfixable. For months, Frank couldn't bring himself to visit Dean's grave. The pain was too raw, too close. He didn't want to face it, didn't want to admit that he had failed his friend. But deep down, Frank knew that this wasn't something he could outrun. The anger eventually turned to regret, and the regret turned to understanding. Frank began to realize that the reason Dean had walked away wasn't because he was weak, but because he had found the strength to choose his own way. Frank had never given him that choice. He had never allowed Dean to be vulnerable, to be broken without judgment. Frank had always been the one who fixed things. But sometimes, fixing something meant knowing when to leave it alone. It was a painful realization, one that Frank had to live with every day for the rest of his life. Years passed, and Frank's life continued in its public grandeur, but the pain of losing Dean never truly faded. It lingered, a shadow that followed him everywhere he went. He had been the one to carry the weight of their friendship, the one who tried to keep it intact, but in the end, it was Dean who had carried the true weight of loss. Frank continued to tell stories of the old days, of the Rat Pack, and the glory years, but they were just stories. The magic was gone. The people who had once adored them as a duo now watched from afar, not knowing the price that had been paid for their success. Frank's heart never fully healed. He performed, he smiled, but he never truly laughed again. The emptiness stayed with him. The world kept turning, and Frank kept moving forward, but the one person who had mattered most to him was gone. And the truth was clear. Frank Sinatra had failed his best friend, not because he hadn't loved him enough, but because love couldn't cure everything. It couldn't fix the deepest wounds. And Frank finally understood that sometimes the greatest act of love was not in trying to save someone, but in knowing when to let them go. The story of Frank and Dean wasn't just about fame or success. It was about the price of friendship, the weight of grief, and the painful truth that some bonds can't be saved by love alone. Dean Martin didn't walk off that stage because he was weak. He walked off because he had found the strength to let go. He had chosen peace over performance, solitude over the spotlight. Frank Sinatra, the man who had conquered the world, couldn't understand that. He couldn't understand why his best friend, the man who had stood beside him for so many years, would choose darkness over light. But Dean's choice was one that Frank would never make. And in that difference, their friendship fractured. The story of their final days together is a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to let someone find their own way, even if it means losing them forever. The lesson that Frank learned too late was that love isn't always enough to save someone. Sometimes you need to allow them the space to grieve, to heal, to choose their own path, even if that path leads them away from you. Frank's regret was that he never allowed Dean to make that choice on his own. Frank and Dean's story is a tragic reminder that even the strongest friendships can be tested by grief. Sometimes, the greatest love is letting go. What do you think? Have you ever had to let someone go when all you wanted was to save them? Let us know in the comments below.